It's the end of the working week, everybody, and that means it's time for some Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated World of Warcraft Classic. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and as you all know by now, this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on the hot button issues and content of the sure to be amazing World of Warcraft Classic. If you hear anything on the show that you'd like to comment on, then check countdowntoclassic.com for all the social links, or email feedback@countdowntoclassic.com with your reactions or memory lane or anger management submissions. Have you dreamt of having your voice heard on Countdown to Classic? If so, then your dream can become a reality. More and more of you are contacting me for your shot at a pre-recorded call about anything World of Warcraft related, which is fantastic. These calls take place anytime from about 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time onwards on Friday and Saturday nights. So let me know if you're keen. For the show's European listeners, I also take calls from about 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. in your part of the world any day of the week. Either email feedback@countdowntoclassic.com or join the show's amazing Discord channel via the link in the show notes and reach out to me there. There'll be more shout outs and show news towards the end of the show, so please do stick around to possibly hear me throw you some love and give you updates on what's to come next week. But for now, let's get to the news and discussions of the week with this week's Forum and Fauna. Each Forums episode on Countdown to Classic, we tackle some of the hot topics from the various World of Warcraft Classic forums. And today, with the assistance of the ever-growing Countdown Council, who help pick these topics, we're starting off with this thread over at the Classic WoW subreddit, posted by user XY13, titled, "When people say not playing on a PvP server isn't an authentic vanilla experience or how the game was intended to be played." And this post simply had a screenshot attached of the realm selection screen, showing that with vanilla World of Warcraft, the choice was obviously normal or player versus player, aka PvP. And to the role-playing fans screaming out now, please realize that I do appreciate that role-playing servers were a choice as well, but just for the purposes of this topic, we'll be taking the role-playing side of things out of the equation, just on the sideline just for a second, and we'll be focusing on the PvE or PvP choices, as opposed to the role-playing PvE or the role-playing PvP choices. So clearly what this post was attempting to highlight was the notion that in vanilla World of Warcraft, it wasn't PvE or PvP as a choice, but normal or PvP. And with the choice that would place you in a PvE realm being dubbed normal, that it was indeed that experience which would be deemed the authentic World of Warcraft experience, or simply how Blizzard intended the game to be played. This creates the following debate. Is it true that PvE is the normal or authentic way in which to play the game, and PvP was considered to be the kitschy tweak for more daring players? Or, despite the wording on that realm selection screen, is it actually PvP that delivers the most authentic World of Warcraft experience to the player? So, this isn't an argument necessarily over whether or not PvP or PvE is better per se, although elements of that kind of chatter will unavoidably pop up during this discussion. But we're putting the spotlight on that keyword of authenticity and which playstyle showcases the most immersive and rewarding consumption of the game. So, as you all know, I'm the gun for hire, and I'll argue for both sides of the coin passionately to ensure that both the PvE and PvP camps get a fair shake of it. So let's get to it and hit the comments that stood out to me throughout this thread and others similar to it that I found along the way. Now, the PvE camp can kick off proceedings, considering that they brought the allegation before the court, so to speak. And we have this comment from user Tethesian, who says this: I'm a PvEer, and I had no idea it was such a big deal before I started looking into private servers. PvE doesn't mean no PvP. I saw raids on towns and outposts while I was leveling, and often people would flag and join in. It wasn't as often or at the scale that you'd see on a PvP server, sure, but there was just more of a sense of honor about it. Next, we have this post from the original poster, XY13, who says this: Everything people say about normal servers is pretty much wrong or exaggerated. I had the huge South Shore versus Taran Mill. We had constant fighting at the crossroads. We had arguably more capital city raids because we weren't fighting out in the world. What we didn't have was 60s griefing in Red Ridge and Stranglethorn Vale. We could just go mine and herb in peace and finish our task quickly. The biggest difference is the raid versus raid fights at world bosses / Blackrock Mountain, which is what's tipping me towards PvP. Other than that, I prefer PvE more. Next we have this post from user Imarak, who says this: My first character leveled on a PvE server and my PvP experiences were definitely crazier than my later character who leveled on a PvP server. The PvPers on PvE servers were generally a lot more ballsy because they had to flag knowing that someone else is going to get the first shot. PvE absolutely does drastically change the feeling of the world for the better. People can quest in the open world without getting ganked if they're not interested in PvP. That is a dramatic change and the majority of WoW players appreciated it. Honestly, I've done world PvP on both types of servers and it takes a lot more balls to flag up on a PvE server because you're always allowing the other unflagged players to get the opener on you. It's like the complete opposite of ganking. It's being such a badass that you dare people to gank you. When I started PvPing on Medivh, I joined World Defense and did nothing but constant world PvP for weeks. I would often roll into a town like Thrallmar or Lobby areas like Crossroads and engage Alliance players in 1v2, 1v3 or 1v5 and fuck up their griefing before dying. When I re-rolled on a PvP server on Lich King with the idea of PvPing full time, there was almost no difference in leveling beyond the occasional gank. I did a lot of similar world PvP as before, but then decided to join an organized PvP guild for large raids. That was a huge disappointment because I quickly found out that everyone was focused on farming kills and would not enter a lopsided fight unless they had overwhelming force. Not perceivable differences in playing skill, in my opinion. I quit the guild out of boredom because waiting 30 minutes for everyone to show up and pass a ready check was like pulling teeth. I think most players are pussies and take getting killed in PvP way too seriously or personally. Now, that's obviously a fair bit of an opening argument there from the PvE crowd, and what they're trying to say is this. PvE gives you options. It is as the game intended. You were supposed to have options at your disposal, not be cornered into a PvP market where you knew that at any turn you could be ganked or griefed and such. At least with the option, it gave the power to the player to elect when they wanted to engage in potentially deadly behavior. Now, with that choice being put in the player's hands and actively being able to engage and disengage in world PvP ultimately was a great boon to how the player decided to spend their time within the World of Warcraft. You could quite easily roll out of bed one morning just being in the mood for a little bit of PvP. And if you were on a PvE server, you just hit that flag up and you're good to go. And guess what? If you roll out of bed the next morning not so much in that mood, then you don't have to do it. Rather than having to go through the rigmarole of being ganked when you're not up for it. So, it is that ganking and that griefing that often people worry about. Being griefed whilst completing the most menial of tasks, but also sometimes when they're actually quite meaningful. Going through your herbalism, going through your mining, farming mobs obviously can be quite important to many a player. And although they might be mundane in nature to other players, it is definitely something that can still be an important task. And when you are being taken down by opposing players while simply trying to get through your tasks of the day, this can be incredibly frustrating to people when they have their playtime elongated by other players' interference. And it is that kind of interference that Blizzard clearly deemed at the concept of the game to not be normal. Thus, why PvE servers were deemed normal. It's not no PvP ever on a PvE server. That's a common misconception. But this is why the PvE servers are the authentic ones that bring you the authentic World of Warcraft experience. Think of Tarren Mill versus South Shore as the post highlights. Those were some epic world PvP fights that occurred very frequently on PvE servers. Simply flag up and decide to join the battle when you see fit. Wouldn't the option be the best way to do it? PvP servers simply open the door to ganking. It can bring out the worst in other players. At least when flagging, people may have a non-verbal agreement not to gank or grief each other. They're both electing just to have a little bit of fun on the side that's not the norm within the bounds of their server. So, with that opening shot, we now turn to the PvP crowd, whose blood may well be boiling after hearing those opening points. And we have this post from user Outlaw Style Kung Fu, who says this. If by meant to be played you mean the boring way, then yes, that's the way it was meant to be played. For some reason, the element of danger in ST Vietnam and Hillsbrad just makes those areas much more exciting. Next we have this post from Persimmon Phil, who tells us this. Yeah, PvE servers are great if you want to pick and choose your PvP encounters. PvP servers are for those that like conflict at any moment. That bit of paranoia and sense of danger you feel while exploring the world is something you'll never get on a PvE server. Next we have this post from Torg on a Scooter, who tells us this. I find it exciting when the world around me is actually dangerous. One of the things I'm most excited for in Classic Escaping ganks and forming rivalries with players while leveling up and seeing each other in different zones is the greatest aspect of an MMO to me. I like having to be kept on my toes. And those posts bring up this overarching point for the PvPers. It's World of Warcraft, not World of Peacecraft, as we all know by now. We talk about authentic old-school MMO values, and many suggest that a threat of PvP danger is a must when looking to enjoy that authentic old-school MMO feel. You want to be peeking around corners. You want to be wondering if you should sit down to drink or eat. Do I have time to drop my guard at this instance? Or should I be very, very wary of who or what could be around any bloody corner? You shouldn't feel safe. That's the whole point. You are in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that happens to have war in the fucking title. Go after each other. That's the point. Be on your toes perpetually. If it's red, it's dead. That should be the mentality that you take when playing World of Warcraft. Now, yes, granted, it sucks when you are killed. It sucks to do graveyard runs. It sucks to be griefed or ganked on a consistent basis. But that may push you to perhaps become a little bit better at the game. It may aggravate you enough to say, you know what, I'm sick of this. I'm going to do something about it. I'm not going to let that player bully me anymore. It can help improve the skill of the player. But what it also helps improve is your immersion in the game. ST Vietnam, that lovable zone where everyone feels on edge as it's highly contested. Or so I'm told, because I didn't play on a PvP server. But I will be when Classic comes out, so I'm really looking forward to all of this. But that kind of feeling and immersion in this absolute war zone creates bonds with fellow faction members. It increases the social ties between players as they call out for help and let other players know where the opposite faction is and the kind of shenanigans that they're up to. Hey, help me take down this group of hordes who are right outside the camp. We need to take them down because they're making it hard for us to level. Hey, hordes, come get this group of Alliance filth out of this area. I can't stand the sight of them anymore. It makes people talk, communicate, and have maybe a little bit of military tactics on the side as we just seek to kill each other. Elevate your immersion in the game by being on the edge of your seat and having the threat high. It is far from a boring experience. It increases engagement and excitement. And at the end of the day, isn't that why we play video games? But now we move back to the PvE crowd again through Oven Cheese 5000, who tells us this. It's the good old they're having fun wrong thingy. People for some reason won't accept if you actually don't enjoy the constant risk of getting corpse camped by a question mark of the opposing faction. If you don't like what they like, there must obviously be something wrong with you. Next we have this from D.196 at the general World of Warcraft subreddit, who says this. After over 12 years, I finally called it quits on a PvP server. I've been on Crush Ridge ever since I began playing the game back when it came out in 2004. I've made multiple toons here and there, but Crush Ridge has always been my home. They were all Alliance toons, and my original main at the time was a human warrior that through the years was turned into an orc warrior. Recently, however, I haven't touched the game in a few years. Legion seemed enticing enough and drew drew me in all over again. Everything was going well until I hit level 110. I began doing world quests and realized how unbelievably frustrating it could be on a PvP server. I finally decided I'd had enough of it and looked into it. Turns out Crush Ridge had such a disproportionate amount of Horde to Alliance, favoring the Horde, that it all made sense. No matter where I went or what I did, Horde always seemed to outnumber me 5-1. As I've grown older, I realize I just want to have fun and not be bogged down by some uber-geared player flying around ganking me because after 40,000 hours in the game, they literally have nothing else to do. Sad. So my life begins anew on a PvE server, and I look forward to never having to deal with that crap again. So after those posts, the points are these. Who are you to tell the PvE crowd what's authentic and what's not? So because we don't like getting ganked by people who are much higher level than us on a PvP server, we're not playing the game the way it was intended? Well, that kind of sounds like bullshit. By actually being able to complete world quests and tasks without the fear of having our time ruined by other jerks, what? That's not authentic? How is the game being dipped in authenticity when I, as a 20 or 30-something leveling player, see a question-marked player come along and just gank me because they had nothing else to do and they did it for the lols? How is that authentic in the way in which the game was meant to be played? No, it's not. Blizzard never intended for that kind of bullshit to go on. And when we talk about things like proportionality, the argument maybe is there for PvP on an even playing field. If it were 50% Alliance to 50% Horde, sure, maybe that's great. But honestly, how often is that happening? 50% of the time? What servers had a true 50-50 ratio? Now granted, many of them were pretty close, but some of them had some pretty messed up ratios, and it all came down to luck of the draw. Balance between population and faction comes into play. What you choose to play as a faction, perhaps a whole bunch of people did the exact same thing, and now you're on one of those really regrettable servers that has a 65-35 balance, which did happen, albeit rarely. There were a couple of servers that had those kinds of balances. I have seen the figures. If I really like the Horde, but we happen to make up 35% of one of those unfortunate servers, I guess it's what? Just fuck me, right? How is that authentic? That wasn't planned by Blizzard, hence why PvP servers were the kitschy ones, the cute ones, the ones that had the sprinkles on top. But now we go back to the PvP crowd, who reply with this through user Reddit Rambler, who says, "It ruins the immersion for me on a PvE server. These guys are supposed to be my sworn enemies, and I can't attack them." Next we have this post from user Tethasian again, who speaks in reply to the previous post, again speaking up for the PvE crowd just quickly when they say this. "Actually, we're supposed to be in an uneasy truce. Personally, I prefer the jeering and taunting and using underhanded methods to get the other player to flag. It creates the illusion that the opposite faction is following some code of honor. To each their own, I'm just saying that PvP servers aren't more right." And the PvP crowd comes back with user Almighty Perrin, who says this. "In an uneasy truce, then explain all the quests involving you, the player, butchering Alliance and or Horde forces in many of the leveling zones. I mean, the intro cinematic itself says the tenuous pact between the Horde and the Alliance has all but evaporated. The drums of war thunder once again. And, for example, Ashenvale, Arathi Highlands, and Alterac Mountains are ongoing war zones. Warsong Gulch, Arathi Basin, Alterac Valley. Not arguing about PvE/PvP though, I'm just saying, lore-wise, being hostile makes much more sense, and I imagine some people care about that. The factions are indeed in a state of war, once again. Next we have this post from user Vanilla WoW is Coming, who says this. It's World of Warcraft. If you see the opposite faction, you should be able to attack it. That's literally what the game, this version, is about. Horde versus Alliance. Next we have this post from Countdown to Classic Discord member Minoru, who tells us this. In vanilla, there was no such thing as a PvE server. If you brought up a server list, there were PvP servers, role-playing PvP servers, and normal servers. That might sound like a silly pedantic thing to point out, but it's an important distinction when perceiving the difference between server types. In other words, by Blizzard's own design, PvP servers were not the normal game experience. I can hear the response already, but it's World of Warcraft. That's just the name of the franchise, a decade old by the time the MMO released. War is not the defining feature of the universe. In fact, this may come as a surprise to a lot of people, but the Horde and the Alliance were not at war during vanilla. You could find evidence of this by reading quest text throughout the game. Tensions were high, but they were not at open war with each other following the events of Warcraft 3. What about Battlegrounds? Surely that's proof of open war between the two factions? Startlingly enough, no, not even then. During the fights in the Battlegrounds, you're fighting on behalf of intermediary factions. You might recall them. The Silverwing Sentinels fight the Warsong Outriders over the deforestation of Warsong Gulch. The League of Arathor and the Defilers fight for resources in Arathi Basin. And the Frostwolf clan defend their territory against the Stormpike Guard. You are fighting side skirmishes that do not represent the Horde or the Alliance at large. If there was all-out war between the factions, would Thrall sit idly by while his own Frostwolf clan was threatened by the dwarves? No, he would lay an almighty elemental smackdown. But he doesn't, because there's a fragile peace, and he's keeping diplomatic relations stable. It could be argued that by engaging in unsanctioned world PvP, Horde players are going against the wishes of their war chief. So, what do all of those fantastic posts bring up? And thanks again to Minoru for that one. I really enjoyed that one. The question is, what about the lore? How does the lore come into play when we talk about the authenticity of PvP or PvE servers in terms of which is the prime experience as deemed by Blizzard? Maybe it's not World of Warcraft after all, but World of Cold Warcraft. Well, not quite as the previous users suggest before Minoru. They said that the drums of war thunder once again, and that they felt it was evident that we're very much so in open warfare between the two factions, Horde versus Alliance. The tenuous pact is Gonskis. But Minoru says, nay, if you dig a little bit deeper, that might not quite be the case. However, I'd be interested to hear all of your thoughts about this one. Do you think that it was clear in the game that the Horde and the Alliance were in open warfare, as in all-out war, or do you think it was a little bit more subtle than that, and there was still that very, very tenuous peace between the two factions that was hanging by an absolute thread? So, PvP servers, do they actually fit lore-wise? Because yes, we freaking hated each other and we were just going around murdering each other. Hence, authenticity. Or do you feel that, nay, we were still at peace, so PvE actually makes more sense because then you could just simply, as an individual player, elect to go a bit rogue and try to kill a random Horde or Alliance player along your travels. Anyway, we move on to the next point from the PvE crowd, and this is from the original poster XY13, who tells us this. Side note, I'm probably going to be on a PvP server myself, and they are quite fun, but people seem to forget this little fact. They aren't PvE servers, they're normal servers. Most of them, and many of the biggest ones, were normal. Normal, also known as the way it was meant to be played, and the authentic experience. And why do I bring up that post and go into the details there? Well, it's right there. Hey, why are we even arguing about all this? It's literally right there in the name. Normal. Case closed. Normal is another word for authentic, one could argue. That being, it's what Blizzard expected most people to play. They chose that word normal to direct the most amount of traffic to those servers. PvE was anticipated to be the most popular, hence the proper World of Warcraft experience. If you wanted to get crazy and mix things up a little bit, then sure, PvP might be for you, but it very much so was mixing it up. It seems an innocuous term, but I can guarantee some thought, perhaps even a lot of thought, went into that decision to call it normal over at Blizzard instead of PvE. Why didn't they just call it PvE? People are somewhat familiar with that term. Was it so prior players didn't scratch their heads over what PvE is? Because normal is such an obvious term? Well, I guess it does make sense that perhaps Blizzard would realize that, hey, we're trying to appeal to a mass market here. We don't want people who haven't had any experience with MMORPGs to go, what the fuck is PvE or PvP? But if they see the word normal there, it's pretty obvious that they're supposed to check that box. But why did they not use the terms, say, normal and hard? Why weren't PvP servers dubbed hard? How are we supposed to know what normal means? Normal could have been, I don't know, one spec choice only instead of 3 for all we knew. Normal, just that word, literally could have been anything. We didn't know what rules it changed back in 2004 when the game released. We just went with it. Screw it. Normal. Okay. I'll take a flyer on that one. Anyway, we go back to the PvP argument with this post from user MW Highlander, who's frequently featured here on the show because I do like their posts. And they say this. I never thought I'd agree with a dirty paladin, but you nailed it. In vanilla, the tension and fun all comes from the fact that you could be attacked at any time at random. The world is dangerous and should be treated with caution. Do you pull another mob at 50% and risk getting attacked as an easy target, or do you play it safe and maybe heal up? It's a two-way street both factions deal with. Farming in an area with equal alliance and horde around is playing with a powder keg. Getting better gear makes you a bigger threat in the open world to the other faction. And yes, even attacking cities to slow some progress of other faction players was as well in your best interest. Or resources were limited and everyone wanted what they could get. Alliance and Horde were openly hostile and rightfully so. It gave the world depth. Next we have this post from user Esvin37 who says this. The one downside about a PvP server is getting ganked by question mark opponents. There's no gain from it except to cause grievance. But saying that, a lot of people are willing to help by grouping up or even bringing their higher level characters. It brings upon some level of camaraderie and adds to the social aspect of the game. Another thing about PvP servers is the excitement it brings when you face someone around your level range. It really tests your abilities and it's just all around fun. For me, I don't see much point of a PvE server as it takes away a very important factor of the game, grouping together to overcome obstacles that you face in the world, even shitty scum gankers. It's part of the game and I say bring it. I would highly recommend a PvP server over a PvE one. And those posts ask us to consider the following. Gameplay mechanics factor in as well. Decisions. I can only imagine the nerve-wracking thoughts as you wondered which zone perhaps to level in. Or, will I stop to drink now or should I do it later? Do I need to maybe just duck behind that tree to drink because I'm a bit afraid being out here in the open? Little decisions like that would factor into the average PvP player's life are not something that I had to go through. But again, it's something that I'm looking forward to. Having to decide not just obviously whether or not there are people around, but whether I can afford to do certain seemingly menial tasks that we take for granted in a PvE environment. Being pushed to perhaps be aware of things like that, but then also get better gear due to world PvP ramifications, then maybe I wouldn't be so lazy if I had that boot up the bum, so to speak. If I'm getting my ass kicked regularly by players who are just basically better or better geared than me, then I would go, you know what? Screw this. I'm going to strive to be competitive. I will go and get that sword that I need. I will go and get that trinket that I need. And then I will be on somewhat, perhaps, of a level playing field. And then if it's simply skill that is the problem, well, I can put in the practice, put in the hours so that I can hold my own out there in the open world on a PvP server. Then the next notion that those posts raised was that of team play. People would group up to overcome world PvP challenges, as I mentioned before. And isn't that what World of Warcraft is all about? The social interaction and, as the post said, the teaming up to overcome hurdles within the game. If you spot a challenge, yell out to a couple of buddies and ask them if they want to help you take it down. That is the authentic World of Warcraft experience. And with that being heavily featured on PvP servers, then you get PvP group challenges plus PvE group challenges on a PvP server, then that would be the total authentic World of Warcraft experience as Blizzard intended it. Now, I'm going back-to-back points here for the PvP crowd as we round out their argument with the following post from Dan Bitman Holograph, who says this. A PvE server limits your player interactions by 50%. You may think you need language to understand an enemy player. You don't. Actions speak loud. You can help them with a mob that's nearly killing them, or you can ensure their doom. You can fight for spawns, or politely wait for each other's turns. The interactions between two people that cannot talk to each other and are meant to fight are great, especially when they refuse to follow the script and they befriend each other. Next, we have this post from Buttery Yeasty Queef. Oh, God. Let's put that in the Hall of Fame of usernames up to this point. Anyway, Perhaps my experience wasn't representative of most people's back then. I only played on PvP servers and it was a good time. Not every member of the opposite faction was a douche nozzle. I remember leveling in STV at NAM, and while I was attacked quite a lot, I remember it being more from people that were around my level, rather than random level 60s waiting around at the ZG entrance. I also recall many moments where a simple slash beg, or even a slash wave, was enough to signal your pacifism if you were busy questing and didn't want to fight. That being said, you're going to get ganked and corpse camped at some point or another. BattleNet integration will probably make this less, or more if you're quick to anger, of a problem. So those posts bring up the following points. You're removing encounters with players in an MMORPG experience if you play on a PvE server. So how could that possibly be considered authentic? And the first post is quite right. You are literally limiting them by 50%. Sure, you can elect to flag and all that jazz, and I guess you can still technically, slash wave and emote and all that stuff at the opposite faction, but it's not really the same if neither party is going to flag. It doesn't really mean as much, or anywhere near as much. But when we talk about the communication between the other players, that's literally why we are here. We don't play this as a single-player RPG. We play it as a massively multiplayer one. We're not just there to see other people. We're there to engage with them, to interact, and communicate, in a manner of speaking, with them as well. Those emotes go a long way when danger is at the forefront. As the posters say, there are actually times when an emote or two could save your ass. You could actually work out a bit of a friendly détente with another player. Who knows where it might take you? Or you could simply teabag and laugh at their corpse. Who knows? We're here together as a community. We're not supposed to be exhibits in a zoo behind a proverbially roped off enclosure that says, "Don't touch the Alliance." You should be encouraged to blow past that rope, break the glass, and smash the Alliance exhibit's head in. And besides, as the second post says, maybe people really did, for the most part, abide by unwritten rules not to mess with people if it wasn't close to a fair fight. Now, from what I've read online, and I've looked into it because, as I say, I'll be playing on a PvP server for the first time when Classic comes around, it does seem that, the majority, I guess you could say, of fights that took place on PvP servers out in the open world were generally within, a few levels of each other. The whole question mark player coming down and just ganking up lobbies, sure, it happened, but it wasn't like it happened all the time. Granted, you're going to get your assholes who do that. But even the assholes will only feel like doing that occasionally. It's not like they spend 24/7 just ganking low-level players, unless they do. And if you're listening, stop it. That's very mean. But anyway, is it all a little bit blown out of proportion on a PvP server when we talk about griefing and ganking and, oh my God, all these horrible things happen to me, I can't play the game properly? Is it really just a lot of whinging from people that perhaps do deserve to be on a PvE server because they can't handle just a little bit of extra time being tacked onto their playthrough to 60? Who knows? Anyway, we go through this post for the PvE crowd to finish up this topic. And this is from user Rindaris, who tells us this. I think the most interesting thing about this screenshot that hasn't really been mentioned is that Blizzard did a really smart thing when they settled on this nomenclature. Instead of PvE and PvP, which makes more intuitive sense and is basically what we think about today when we're talking about PvP and normal servers. Normal does not mean PvE in the same way that PvP does not mean only PvP. Normal wasn't envisioned as some kind of hippie enclave for peace-loving fans of Warcraft dreaming of orc-human unions. Those were role-playing servers. It was the default rule set where every part of the game was elective. You want to PvE? You can. Feel like PvP? You can. It was about player choice. No one was forcibly subjected to an activity that they did not want to partake in. This is what's really different about PvP servers. Want to PvE? You can. Want to PvP? You already are. So with that post done, here's what Rindaris was basically getting at and what I'm going to extrapolate on a little bit now. Both servers have the same content at the end of the day. There are just elective choices involved. Both could be said to provide the authentic World of Warcraft experience. And besides, without a definition or statement from Blizzard on what the authentic consumption of World of Warcraft is, then how do we even know what that is? The authentic World of Warcraft experience is subjective. Perhaps at the end of the day, you can't say that either side isn't playing the real World of Warcraft. Once you log into either kind of realm, you're going to get an authentic experience and a version that was intended by Blizzard. Man, it's comfy sitting on this fence here. And from the fence, we launch into the second topic of the day. And this topic was a post I found over again at the WoW Classic subreddit, put up by user Humble Person, and it was titled the following: Should Classic WoW be a living game that grows and changes, or should it be a static game that's frozen? Now, in getting into this topic, I just want to preface this argument with the following. We'll be focusing more on a potential patch 1.13, an argument that some more content that isn't already in the game or any expansion could potentially be placed into Classic once we get a little bit further down the track. And this would obviously be an alternative to doing something like the Burning Crusade Classic. Now, I'll focus on the possibility of the Burning Crusade Classic in another episode. So that's why you won't be hearing me touch on it much during this argument. What I really just want to focus on is the argument over whether or not Classic is something that should grow and expand with new content, or should it simply be frozen in time as it is? And we'll get into what the original poster of this thread said, and they said the following: I'm thinking about games like EverQuest and RuneScape that have recreated older versions of the game. The idea here is that one of the most original concepts in World of Warcraft was that the world was alive and reacted to things that people did. In my opinion, I worry that if we time-locked a classic server, the classic World of Warcraft would turn into the same thing as an old console game that I can put in and play, which would be cool, but I also think it wouldn't be classic WoW, because I remember a world that was still growing and had much to discover, not a world with everything completed and final. Now, just before we get into both sides of the coin here, I do understand that this is somewhat of a hairy topic. I'm not advocating for a patch 1.13, but I do find it to be somewhat worthy of discussion, as is any topic really here. We're just throwing shit against a wall and seeing what sticks. Anything is plausible with the future of World of Warcraft Classic. Now, don't get me wrong, some scenarios are far more probable than others, and I do believe that something like the Burning Crusade Classic is far more probable than a patch 1.13, but we can't rule anything out, so screw it. Let's talk about it. And I know it's one of the bigger arguments outside of really the broader changes versus no changes, because this actually would be a subsection of that. It's actually a pretty massive change that we're talking about. But it comes down to a crucial argument of how tied to the past are we? We're basically engaging in a bit of retro gaming when we sit here as fans of World of Warcraft vanilla. Would we ask the same of other games upon their re-release? Would we say, hey man, where's the extra content? Yeah, I know I loved that game back in the day, but I want a bit more. It's a bit of an odd one at times, and also a bit of a prickly one, so I understand that this might get some listeners' blood boiling. But it comes back to a question about expansions. Do we want expansions with World of Warcraft Classic? Do we want to go through the merry-go-round again of the trilogy, as we call it? Do we want the Burning Crusade Classic? Do we want Wrath of the Lich King Classic? Or do we want just patch 1.13 and expand with effectively new expansions? The question is, do we want to go beyond Naxxramas? That's really what it comes down to. So, a funny extension of this is the factions that it kind of creates as well within the no changes crowd. There are some who feel that they want no changes in the game, obviously. But within that section of fans, there are also some that cry out for extra new content. No changes, but extra content, which is a change. Now, granted, this is a minority of the no changes crowd, I'm sure, but it's an interesting thing that comes up regardless. But also, we presume when we talk about this kind of argument that Blizzard will actually devote resources to this kind of extra content. Now, we've been explicitly told by Blizzard that they don't wish to devote too much time and attention or resources to the classic project. So, why are we sitting here even talking about this? If they've told us they're just doing this as a bit of fan service, and hopefully this shuts the classic crowd up, and they don't want to spend oodles and oodles of money on it and time on updating or maintaining the game, why bother talking about it? Well, the funny thing about that is, money talks. And if World of Warcraft Classic blows up and hits some lofty heights with subscribers and creates that cash cow again for Blizzard, well, that very well might spur on some further discussions about what they do with Classic from that point on. Do they look to the Burning Crusade? Do they look to going through a bit of a sliding doors moment and perhaps just doing it all differently with new content? Well, as we do here on Countdown to Classic, we will discuss both arguments, and I will argue for both sides of the coin passionately. So we've got two crowds here. We've got the pro-living crowd and the anti-living crowd. So we'll start with the pro-living world crowd, the crowd that wants to see the game go through a patch 1.13. And here's what they say through user 3DS Rocks, who says this: I personally would like the option to play on a server that offered new raids past Naxxramas as long as the level cap stayed at 60. I also want servers that are completely static at 1.12. I feel like I'm in the minority on this opinion though. User Plated Slicer chimes in with this: I'm not so sure that you are in the minority. Most people waiting for Classic are fond of World of Warcraft and the Warcraft universe, but are not so pleased about the way they've gone. If there's a chance of a parallel universe that takes things in a direction more to their liking, I think most would take it. The catch, of course, and the excellent reason why so many are militant against changes is that vanilla is the last point in time where most everyone can agree on, okay, this works well enough for me. Once the floodgates of wouldn't it be nice if are opened though, all bets are off. So for now, it's probably best to stay the course. And once the servers have been up for a bit, Blizzard and the players can engage in a very careful conversation over what happens next. Next, we have this post from user Calpothes, who says this: I really want content post-Nax that keeps the level 60 cap also. If no new content is created, then the longer-term viability is called into question. I know some want to have the Burning Crusade with player transfers. However, I would love to see more content created for 60. I think a Burning Crusade release would then bleed the classic player base and fragment it. Having said that, I expect Blizzard would be more likely to go to the Burning Crusade re-release route. My main argument against that is that level cap change made so much content obsolete, whereas if you add new content at the same level cap, the older content is still playable. And the arguments with those posts is that yes, World of Warcraft absolutely should live and grow, as any MMO would be expected to do. Why bring back an MMO and take away one of the key features of the genre, being expanding on content? Building on brick after brick after brick, building something up from a foundation that allows the game to keep on going. But some of you might be saying, Josh, we will be expanding on content via content progression from vanilla World of Warcraft. True. However, what happens once we get to Nax? What happens once Nax has been around for a while? Yes, people do want content post-Nax. They are out there. But is it a minority of players or a majority who seriously have thought about this and want it? And how would you even do it? Well, as you hear from these posters, that crowd who wants this patch 1.3 seems to be relatively universally agreed that the level cap should very much so stay at 60. Let's not go nuts and start doing the expansion after expansion and doing the old 70, 80, 90 thing again. They're saying keep it at 60. That's what we want. But there is a way in which you can expand and build on the game and still keep us at that same level. Throw in a few more raids here, a few more items there, and Bob's your uncle, right? Well, maybe it gets more complicated than that. We might hear about that later. But the Burning Crusade, I'm not getting into it, but yes, just lightly, it would fragment the audience depending on how they roll it out. Now, this particular option of simply doing a patch 1.13 does keep everyone at 60, but also, perhaps more importantly, it keeps the old content relevant by keeping us in Azeroth. We're not all going to be tooling around in Outlands. We're going to be staying put where we are. Potentially. Who knows? Maybe they do new zones. Would they do that? Who knows? New battlegrounds. I don't know. They could do anything. But we go now to the other crowd who says nay to patch 1.13 and the anti-living crowd who says this through user Sulinia. I legit don't think they want to make new content for vanilla. One of the main reasons why is because giving people the slightest new content or changed content is going to start a civil war where people will use new content or changed content as an excuse as to why X thing should be in the game or changed. And ultimately, having done this once, they might feel like they have to alter the game to make it even better. Slippery slope. If they do decide to make new content, I feel like they have to make harder content than Naxxramas/Dungeons. With the foundation of 1.12 being set in stone, all content is going to be steamrolled by a vast majority of players, and having more raids to just do without rewarding better gear than Nax is going to feel weird and honestly out of place. So going forward with better gear, you need to have harder challenges, And this is where the problem comes into play. I absolutely can't see how they can make Vanilla WoW harder in a good way. The game is very straightforward in how it's played, and most of the difficulty doesn't come in being flat out hard to execute mechanics, but rather the fact that it's unforgiving in the sense that if you fuck up a somewhat easy mechanic, you're fucked, and stabilizing is very hard. People fucking up usually always ends up in wipes, even with 1.12 talents. So what do? Make harder mechanics just like retail? Sure, but retail is suited for people to overcome these mechanics, while vanilla is pretty dull in terms of movement, healing, and so forth. How much difficulty can you exactly shove into vanilla without having to give classes and specs new and different abilities to overcome these different mechanics? Now, the point raised there is a very, very poignant one, and it's this. We could potentially start a whole new civil war, so to speak, over this issue. We're still going through the whole changes versus no changes civil war, which admittedly is dying down a little bit in my opinion, but why would Blizzard possibly do that all again? Why give rise to potentially more toxicity within the community? Why would Blizzard poke the bear? They know what they just went through with the community with all this changes versus no changes crap and the stuff that had started on the forums. I doubt they'd want to see that happen again. But if they did do it, what would it be? Would the content be harder than Nax? How much would you want to alienate the majority of players that perhaps didn't even get to Nax? But then on the flip side, if you created content that wasn't necessarily harder than Nax, but still challenging within the bounds of a 1.12 environment, how would that work out? Could they do something that fits with 1.12 talents and 2018/2019 era theory crafting and still pose a challenge but isn't ridiculous like Nax? I don't know. I don't know if they could do it. Some of you might be saying if it's not harder than Nax, then it's not worth doing. Well, to some, they may disagree. The people who want more raids, I feel, are the minority. Have you even cleared Nax? If you are asking for more beyond Nax, I would certainly want to hope that you were one of the, 120 or 130 or so guilds that actually got through Nax back in the vanilla days. If you didn't and you're screaming out for more, get through that stuff first and then let's talk. Because quite frankly, Nax is still a little bit of a challenge. I appreciate that the top guilds, the top guilds, may face roll Nax, but the vast majority won't. So why would you want something harder? Just relax. We're fine with what we've got difficulty-wise. Maybe. To the majority. Some of you might be scoffing at that notion, and I appreciate that if you're a highly skilled raider. But we move on now back to the pro-living crowd who bring up this point. And this is user IBD95. It worked for 2007 RuneScape. Who's to say it won't work here? Then we have this post from user Zim who tells us this. As an old-school RuneScape player who's sort of watching classic WoW from afar, the progress of content is what kept old-school RuneScape alive. Not the addition of content as it happened initially, but new content that is in keeping with the playstyle of old-school RuneScape. The dev team is also pretty good when it comes to listening to the community. In-game polls need to reach 75% in favour for things to be passed, and even voting has a list of requirements to avoid rigging. What you guys really need, and will probably be the hardest part, is getting Blizzard to dedicate a dev team to Classic that actually listens to the community. The fact that subs like this exist and are so active at the mere mention of Classic should hopefully send Blizzard the message that this could be really big for them if done correctly. Next we have this from user Le Corel who tells us, I feel like the best thing they could do is open up more classic content after X amount of years. They have many things they could do. An Emerald Dream dungeon. Hell, even a cool Furbolg dungeon in Fellwood, etc. OSRS did this. They opened up new content that they don't have in current RuneScape. I like the idea of Blizz slowly opening up new content for Classic versus just going back into the Burning Crusade and Wrath and so forth. I loved those expansions, don't get me wrong, but I don't think they'll just stop all of a sudden after Wrath. And if they did the expansion route, it would soon lead back into what retail is today. And those posts raised the following. The model is there. Old school RuneScape. Now, admittedly, I didn't play RuneScape or old school RuneScape. I actually have no idea about RuneScape. I've seen like 2 minutes worth of footage. I couldn't know less, but I definitely know about what they did with the re-release of old school. It was a great concept and something that was embraced by the players. And I do know that new content that wasn't in the original game was slowly released to the players. And they loved it. You know why? They actually had a say in what was coming their way. They, as the posters suggested, had to clear a 75% majority vote in order for the new content that was desired to be put into the game. Now, could you see Blizzard doing something like that? Personally, I'm a little bit skeptical that Blizzard would go down such a route of taking such a great toll in what the players have to say. But, I mean, obviously, I'm sure they listen to us in some regard, but I couldn't exactly see polls being sent out to players. And, God, imagine some of the mayhem that would come there. Anyway, but things when you talk about new zones, hey, vote on a new zone, vote on a new raid. Who knows? It could be a bit of fun, but I doubt it would happen. But what I'm getting at is that Blizzard would very much so have studied the way in which old school RuneScape was handled. And I'm sure they probably learnt a lot. So let's see if it will factor in at all later down the track. But we go back to the anti-living crowd now, who says this through user 80s were cooler. My initial thought was absolutely no new content. Leave vanilla alone. The biggest reason is that one of the reasons I quit after Wrath was the constant flow of new endgame that invalidated my prior accomplishments. I'm probably the only one that thinks the constant updates were too many and came too often. It seems like every time I progressed to endgame raids, a new patch with new raids and a higher level cap and adjusted talents came out. I never felt like I could quite get to the top. It's not like I didn't play much. I was pouring hours into World of Warcraft every day. No kids back then. I suppose after all of this, I'd be open to new content releases, but only after like 5 years. I want to enjoy the experience of leveling and progression without the floor being pulled out from underneath me every 6 months. Next we have this post from user OvenCheese5000 once again, who tells us this. I don't really get why people want new content, meaning raids, post-Nax. You would have the game become more and more horrible for completely new players as time progresses. Imagine starting to play World of Warcraft Classic with lots of post-Nax content, but no Burning Crusade, obviously. Hitting 60 only to see that you have to progress through 10 raid tiers while most guilds are not even bothering with raiding Molten Core or Blackwing Lair anymore. Or if they do, they're already so well geared that they just cut through the raid with their tier 9 gear, so the early raid content is being trivialized even then. And what these posts are bringing up is the following point. Not everyone wants to chase the tier dragon. Tier 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I just worked my ass off over the past 3 months for this fucking gear, and now it's obsolete? Is that what you're telling me? Now I gotta go do it all again? That's a bit of a bummer. Now, why would Blizzard want to keep pushing us and pushing us? Well, some of you might be yelling out, money, that's why. And yes, that might well be the case. But we go back to the patches question and how quickly they came perhaps through vanilla. Well, I hear quite often that, patches were dropped so often in vanilla. However, think about it this way. After about 7 months of the game, after release that is, we got Blackwing Lair. Then 6 months later, we got AQ. Then 6 months later, we got Nax. Then 7 months later, we got Burning Crusade. People often talk about Nax like we had it for all of 2 seconds before the Burning Crusade dropped. It was 6.5 months that we had it around for. Now, again, you are only rewarding the hardcore raiders who focus on progression if patch 1.13 is released and is raid focused. Why would Blizzard bother to appease 5 to 10% of the population playing World of Warcraft Classic? There's many more players who aren't even going to get to Nax or beyond. We are really catering to just the top 1 to 2% at times if we go nuts with like a couple of extra tiers. However, they can always release other stuff outside of raids. I do understand that. But if they didn't, well, what if you were a new player jumping into World of Warcraft Classic? Good luck wanting to be a raider. You'd practically have to rule it out straight away. No one would run you through a couple of 3, 4, 5 tiers to get you through that early stuff to get to the places beyond Nax. Now I understand there's certain things that could be done, such as, catch-up items or catch-up raids that they could do, a la ZG. Who knows? But it is just a little bit of a funny way of looking at it if they just focused on appeasing the top players. But we go back now to the pro-living crowd who say this through user Slaint Math. I 100% want new content. I just never want the level cap to change. Nor do I want new tiers of content that are basically a continent of 5 zones surrounding a hub city that all new gameplay takes place in. Keep adding on to the vanilla world in the same spirit. Things that take you across zones and then back again. If you end up with 10 tiers of raid content after 3 years, then retune and normalize a bunch of them so that players now have more options instead of making them obsolete. So the point that user raises is this. Do it, just don't do it like retail. Feel free to bring the new content. It's all good, but not everyone fell in love with the way in which it was presented in many expansions that we got. And it did seem to get much more, condensed into those small hubs as each expansion came out. People didn't necessarily fall in love with the hub concept. Don't get me wrong, I know some people enjoyed it, but many vanilla players pine for those days of running around across the world from continent to continent just in order to complete 1 or 2 quests. Now, I know it sounds tedious, and you get to the point where you think, what? Why would you want to go back to a time when it took 30 to 45 minutes to complete a quest just traveling around? Well, it's the slow burn that a lot of us vanilla fans do enjoy. And for some reason, we did take great pleasure in some of the pain that we felt in hauling ass around the World of Warcraft. The thought of being placed into a quest hub and having a million quests within a very short distance of the quest givers and just turning a lot of things in within a very short period of time didn't really give as great a sense of achievement or immersion into this broad, absolutely sprawling world that we all fell in love with. The latter point that user raises is that We might very well wind up with a situation if the devs do simply build and build and build brick upon brick and raid upon raid with, here we are at tier 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 within vanilla. If we do the 1.13 thing, we don't want to alienate new players to Classic who might not jump in from day one and have them realize, shit, I have got to go through a boatload of tiers to get to tier 10 or whatever it might be, and they may well quote-unquote retune things by introducing new items, just like they did with 1.12 back in the day. Catch-up raids, catch-up items. We might get a new ZG in a way, in terms of here's a raid that will let you jump in at a certain point so that the old stuff isn't necessarily rendered obsolete by the fact that you can never do it because no one will run you through it all in order to get to the utmost tier, if you know what I'm saying. I hope I've explained that correctly. Now, another point that we bring up when we're asking for more content, just don't do it like before, is perhaps we also don't want gold to be so easy to come by. That was one of the negative points that many players of the later expansions came to comment on, was exactly how easy it was to get money by doing very little. Daily quests, things of that nature, everything just seeming to drop more gold, quests giving you more gold. Everyone was swimming in it at a certain point as the expansions went by. However, as we all know, or many of us do, back in the vanilla days, it was hard to get 2 pennies to scratch together at times, and making gold was an arduous task. So don't trivialize it if you do happen to make new content by making the same mistakes from the past and making it rain by just having everyone be the proverbial millionaire. Also, we don't necessarily even need new zones if you are going to do new content. You could possibly just pop up a new cave in an established zone that leads to Man Crick's wife's lair or something, now that she's a banshee boss, maybe we could do. But you don't need to build new geography. There's plenty there, and this is just an option. Obviously, many people will say, no, give us the new regions, give us the new zones. That's what expansion building is doing. That's what building upon vanilla should be all about. But we don't have to go down that road. You can still build with what we have. I am sure it's quite easy, as I say, just add to what we already have. But we move back to the anti-living crowd with this post from user Joseph the Fritzl, who says this, Jesus. My perfect classic WoW server would be frozen in time. Logging in should feel like waking up from a 13-year-long dream and returning to the world as it existed prior to any of the pre-patching for the Burning Crusade. This puts me in the minority crowd, in that I have no problem with raids being too easy, Nax being available at release, or the absence of any other faux progressive behavior on the server. All it needs to be is exactly what it was before it became something else. I could live in that proverbial moment for many, many years. Next we have this post from user KZZ, who says this. In vanilla, the worlds did not react to things that players did, with maybe one exception, the war effort. This thread is just the same old dumb argument that people have been posting on here since day one. It boils down to vanilla WoW changed, so Classic should too. No, the goal of Classic is to recreate vanilla. Adding non-vanilla changes will just fuck everything up. Every time Blizzard intentionally adds non-vanilla quests, instances, content, talents, balances, etc. to Classic, they are failing at what they set out to do here. If playing a static game with no surprises bothers you, then maybe Classic WoW isn't for you. Next we have this post from user Mold on My Window, who says this. I think ultimately Blizzard wants to develop something that preserves their MMO in history. To me, this probably means that after all of the vanilla content is released, for as long as possible, they want to have at least one server running regardless of the player base and no additional content. However, In the case where the retail WoW population dwindles to the point that Classic has more active players, then there might be some serious considerations to branch off certain servers and add content. This will only work if the developers focus on the aspects that make vanilla great and avoid changes to core gameplay. We will have to see how everything pans out. Now, I've read those few posts out because they bring up this point. Have we considered the notion that World of Warcraft should be preserved as somewhat of a museum exhibit, leaving it in its state as it was back in the day and untouched for Classic, leaves it as somewhat of an archive, a testimonial, a shout out, an exhibit of the past, saying this is how we did it back in the day. Just leave it alone. We don't care if the raids are easy. We got good. Okay, we'll live with it. We don't ask the same thing of other retro games. Why do we not say about things like Super Mario Brothers or Legend of Zelda from, say, the NES days? Hey, you know what would be awesome? If we just added a couple of things. No, we don't. We get our friends to play those games who maybe haven't played them, and we say, hey, check out this old game. It's wonderful. I love it as is. It is a preserved piece of art. Check it out. This was started as a project of preservation. That's what Classic was all about. Bringing back something, restoring it as it was popular back in the day. Not to put a new hat on it and have people be up in arms. The other point that these posts bring up is that if Classic were to be incredibly popular, that's wonderful. However, if the popularity were to eventually dwindle one day and many years down the track we get to the point where not that many people, relatively speaking, are even playing Classic, is the argument there to keep a server running in perpetuity? And obviously I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I don't expect this thing to be running forever and ever and ever. But is there an argument for a server to be going for the next, 10 years, 20 years? What are we saying? EverQuest is still going when I last checked. What would be wrong with keeping vanilla World of Warcraft running? Surely, with the success that Blizzard has had, it wouldn't be a thorn in their side to keep one server going many years down the track for the couple of thousand people that might still be interested many, many years later. Now, you might scoff and say, Josh, I think there'll be more than a couple of thousand people who will be always interested in playing on vanilla WoW. And who knows? But just always having the living museum running is a fun thought and something I personally would be checking in on in 15 to 20 years' time. I can guarantee you I would roll a new character for shits and gigs in 15 years' time as a 50-year-old man just to go, I wonder how World of Warcraft's going. I remember when I played that game and when I went crazy and did a podcast on it for a while. What do you think about that idea? But we now go back to the pro-living crowd who say this, and this is from user Funkalicious. I absolutely think that WoW should grow and thrive and continue to be new all the time. That's part of what makes the game amazing. WoW actually has its own history within the world. Think about that. That being said, I think for the sake of the players and also for preservation, there needs to be realms of WoW in various forms throughout the years, frozen in time for people to explore. Perhaps it could even be made into a cool game mechanic where you have a time machine. This would allow new players to go back and experience stories and events from years ago. Blizzard has a crazy world with World of Warcraft, and I think it's important to preserve it. So, that post acknowledges that yes, perhaps it is a great idea to preserve World of Warcraft as it was in a certain state, but How would you do it? Perhaps it's worth it considering that we have a variety of different server types. Yes, maybe one day we will get the Burning Crusade Classic. We will get Wrath of the Lich King Classic. And who knows, if they go crazy, you get your Miss, your WoD, your Legion Classic, BFA Classic, whatever. However, is it prudent for Blizzard to offer the whole buffet of the World of Warcraft experience at different junctures in time to the players? How much work does Blizzard want to do? And would they be interested in offering many options for the players to choose how they liked their World of Warcraft? The fallout from that, however, is how watered down would the experience be and how spread out would the player base be? Now you are segmenting perhaps a dying player base over, I don't know, a dozen servers, 24 servers, who knows? Now you've got the no changes vanilla PvP server, the changes PvE server, here's the WoD RP server, and so forth and so forth. It gets crazy. There would be many of them and maybe too many options. But I mean, it's still something technically they could do, but I would highly doubt it considering that Blizzard is not particularly interested in, as they say, not even running 2 MMORPGs at once, let alone the same one in 25 different states. We move back now to the anti-living crowd, who says this through AndyCaps969. Blizzard isn't going to dedicate development resources to a 14-year-old version of their game. Additional content at 60 isn't realistic. They'll transition to Burning Crusade. And user Haywood Jablomi 12 says this. It would be great to have new content, but there's no way that's happening. They don't want to run 2 MMOs. It's possible in the very, very long-term future we see maybe the Burning Crusade and expansion-based servers, but only as a last salvage by Blizzard before the game dies. Blizzard sees Classic as a side game for people to come back, relive their nostalgia, and then go back to the real game. This isn't an entirely separate game. There are a ton of hints as to their thinking. One of the big ones was during the trailer, having Chromie do a reveal and use a device that takes you back in time. You're still in the actual game, just in a different time than what retail is taking place in. You're not booting up a different version of WoW. Now, that last post actually really got me thinking, and I've not heard anyone else raise this before, that is Classic potentially a bit of a side game within retail? Is it a novelty? Is it a freak show within the main game? I honestly, through all of my forum readings over the last few months, have not seen anyone else suggest that that's the way in which it could be delivered to us. It is an interesting notion, albeit I think quite unlikely. I like the way that that user is thinking outside of the box. However, I know many of you are eye-rolling right now. Yes, of course, it is more than likely, in fact, I would say nigh on a foregone conclusion that we're pretty much just going to get different server options and you'll get a different, maybe login screen or just, when you're picking your server, it just says Classic or whatever. I don't think we'll be forced to log into retail and then go through some kind of time warp in there to go back to Classic. But nonetheless, these users bring up a few good points. Blizzard has specifically said they do not want to run 2 MMOs. They're not interested in vastly increasing their workload. They don't want Classic to be more work than it has to be. So with them humoring us vanilla fans with this quote-unquote novelty or freak show, it's fine, maybe this will shut the vanilla fans up, they still don't want to do it to crazy amounts of work and eating up time, money, and resources. So, are we going to get that patch 1.13 knowing that they maybe just kind of want to walk away from it at one stage? Who knows? But you know what? I think money kind of talks, and if Classic is incredibly successful, they may be put into a hard position and make a very, very big call about whether or not they do build on their baby. We stick with the anti-living crowd now as we round out this topic, and there's lots of posts here, so please just listen in as I rattle all of these off. And we go firstly with user PogChamp, who says this. Thankfully, Blizzard did add that content to Classic by way of a little-known addition to the game, a so-called expansion pack. You might have heard of it. Next we have user Frothy, who says this. Have you played a private server yet? I don't know where this fear people have about content comes from. Just go and play any private server and see for yourself. Classic does not need new content. Then we have this from user LMS Medvi, who says this. Don't you see the irony? A lot of people are discontent with World of Warcraft because of the changes. They want the original back. Blizzard releases the original again. Then they start to change it. Again. It's just silly. They can then bring back the original again. Classic is a time capsule. It will be what World of Warcraft was. It should never be changed. If people want a different game, they should ask for a different game. World of Warcraft 2, Vanilla Plus. Call it what you will. Just please leave Classic alone. Next we have this one from user Hexies, who says this. There's already a living, breathing version of WoW. It's called Retail. I guarantee you guys that if they start adding content to Classic, it's not going to feel like vanilla content. It's going to feel like retail content. You can't just stuff lightning back into a bottle whenever you please. For example, Eminem can release all the new albums he wants, but he'll never be as good or as relevant as he once was. It's best to leave well enough alone. Perhaps they can do the Burning Crusade servers in the future that people can transfer their characters to. Perhaps they can do bi-yearly seasons in Classic or something like that. With any luck, they won't try to add more content to Classic. People are deluding themselves if they think Blizzard of 2018 can emulate the feel of content that Blizzard of 2000X produced. It's just not possible, folks. They've proven it with Diablo 3, StarCraft 2, and Retail WoW. Next, we have a short reply from the pro-living crowd who chime in quickly with this one from ShadowX93CA, who says, are you just going to flat out ignore that they went and headhunted people who were passionate about vanilla World of Warcraft to program it? That doesn't play a role at all. I'm not for either side, but you're clearly ignoring a slight detail here. And the anti-living crowd gets back again through Hexies, who says this. That doesn't matter. They went headhunting for people who were passionate about Diablo, and yet Diablo 3 is nothing like the first two games made by Blizzard North. Vanilla's content is a snapshot in time of how a specific team of artists and content creators worked and operated, each design choice representing the collective personalities and preferences of the team's constituents. In short, it was lightning in a bottle, and you can't just decide to recapture it. So I know I read a fair few posts there, and thank you so much for listening through that narrative, but here's the moral of the story from everything that I've just read out to you. Newsflash. You want new content? You've actually already got it, and it is a game called World of Warcraft. The modern version, the quote-unquote retail version of the game. If you like older content, there's another game coming called World of Warcraft Classic. Why bother doing the circle of life all over again? Why would we change vanilla World of Warcraft and add to it by way of a patch 1.13 when that would just be simply doing exactly what we've done before? Why do drastic changes need to come about when that's exactly what so many of us are up in arms about in the first place? The drastic changes to the game got us to the point where we are. Now, if you like retail, that's fine. It is a fine game for some people. A lot of people, however, do not enjoy that game anymore, which is perfectly fine as well. Hence why Classic came to be. The amount of people that called out for the game to be as it was back in the day is the exact reason that we're here getting Classic coming our way. Why would we make the same mistakes of the past? Just leave it. We don't need new content. It's a bit of a sliding doors moment. Why do it? Why let them have the opportunity to go all retail on us again? The Blizzard team as it stands now is obviously not the same. Yes, I can hear some of you shouting, but they still have staff there from the original team. They absolutely do. Many of them. However, turnover over 15 to 20 years has happened. World of Warcraft started development a long freaking time ago. Yes, it was released in late 2004, but development started at least 5 years before that. The team has changed over the years, and we don't have the same people who are coming up with the ideas and also being as hungry as they were for success. You can't just produce that classic content with a flick of a switch. Oh, people want vanilla-esque content? We can do that. That's not how it works. My favorite analogy, and I do appreciate the analogy that the user in the post from before mentioned when they talked about obviously Blizzard North and things like that, and also when they mentioned M&M. But my number one analogy, which I have mentioned on the show before, is that of The Simpsons. Look, with The Simpsons, Conan O'Brien isn't there anymore. Phil Hartman, sadly, is gone. This is why we can't get The Simpsons to be as amazing as it was back in the day when it first started. I'm a huge Simpsons fan. People talk about seasons 3 to about, 8, 9, 10, depending on how far you're willing to stretch it, as being glory years that the staff of now have never even come close to recapturing. The show hasn't been relevant or funny in any way, shape or form for about 18 years, which is a really long time because the guys working on it now, God bless their efforts, cannot achieve that lightning in a bottle. And unfortunately, I feel like the situation is the same over at Blizzard. People change over time. So the old crew that's still there now, they now might have different ideas about how the game should go. They're not as passionate about chasing that success. They've already got it to the tune of billions of dollars. The young, new, hungry people coming in, looking to make a name for themselves within the company, don't have the same ideas or grew up with different styles of games so that their tastes have been influenced in different ways. Yes, sure, they've seen what vanilla was. They know about the game. They've played it inside and out. But they didn't make it, and they don't know about what really goes into forging something for a die-hard old-school MMO crowd. They are building things for retail which does not sing to the older style MMO values. And that is a point of contention within the community. So I rest with that Simpsons analogy. I hope some of you like that. Please do let me know. But I think the user from above is exactly right. You cannot just decide to recapture lightning in a bottle. It was an amazing moment in time that gave us something that has become such a huge part of our lives. And sadly, that moment is gone. The good thing is, they're giving it back to us by way of re-releasing Classic. But I'll leave you with this one post from user Shijis, who says this: I think at this point we shouldn't be asking these questions. One step at a time, too much, too soon. And I wholly agree with that. We're getting ahead of ourselves and are vastly jumping the gun when we sit here and start to talk about a possible patch 1.13 or the Burning Crusade Classic or anything like that. Let's look after number one first. World of Warcraft Classic, coming whenever it does. And with all that done, now it's time for anger management. Each episode on Countdown to Classic, I bring you some of the angriest posts that I've found throughout the week, and these can be in relation to anything, not just the topics that we've discussed. So I'll begin with Countdown to Classic Discord member Hey Odin, who says this: "I'ma let it all out right now. Fuck you people who never buff. I remember on other private servers it was an absolute joy to help each other, but on Cuckdale, everyone's out for themselves. You can expect that with around 8,000 players online. Blizzard, take notice and have plenty of servers. I don't want to feel like I have to be greedy to get ahead in the game. For you people that do, fuck you." Next we have this submission from Countdown to Classic Discord member Minoru, who says the following: "Alright, time for another Minoru essay. Cracks fingers. I'm getting tired of hearing the phrase quality of life as if it's a legitimate argument in the classic forums. Battle Masters ruined WoW, their quality of life. Cross-realm battlegrounds ruined WoW, their quality of life. Take a step back and realize that phrase has no meaning, and argue the point based on their true merits and faults, people. You know what else is quality of life? Add-ons, Flight Masters, mounts and Hearthstones. Yet, you don't see anyone champion against those in World of Warcraft. These people are clearly biased in favour of any quality of life that was in the game before they started playing vanilla, and against any quality of life after. If anti-quality of life posters were truly consistent, they would have no problem with these additional demands. No Hearthstones. Their quality of life given to everybody. They make Shaman's Astral Recall redundant and clash with Mage Portals to reduce class identity. What? You finish a dungeon and expect to have a free teleport home? In what reality is that reasonable? You better hope that you have a friendly mage to make a portal, or you're walking all the way back, buddy. No mounts except for warlocks and paladins. Why? Because it's part of their class identities from all the way back to Warcraft 2. Both classes use spellcasting and mana to summon their mythical class mounts from another plane of existence. What's that? You want to buy a mount and put it in your backpack? You don't even feed it? That's the epitome of quality of life. Suck it up and hoof it. No Flight Masters. Tons of people agree that flying mounts were a bad idea, but Flight Masters are just as guilty of using them. Why did they get a free pass? Public transportation is absolutely quality of life. You want to go somewhere? Go there yourself. No add-ons. A lot of add-ons in the game are purely there to increase quality of life and make the game easier. This means no unit frames, no boss mods, no threat meters, no auction enhancements. Use the standard Blizzard UI. Does all of this sound ridiculous? Of course it does. Quality of life is a meaningless argument. Stop using it. Please base your opinions on real, tangible pros and cons of the subject instead." Ooh. Next we have this one from listener Nikos, who tells us the following: "Legion completely destroyed PvP with the idiotic template system. The template system, in theory, was something that some people were excited for, but turned out to be an absolute catastrophe, as gearing your character using trinkets, gems and enchants were completely meaningless for PvP. All changes that completely go against what an MMORPG is supposed to be. Due to these changes, there is literally zero incentive to PvP. The prestige system was also a blatant rip-off from Call of Duty and had no place in an MMORPG. Even after Blizzard realised their mistake and made it to where once you capped it, you automatically continue to rank up without losing your honor talents, as no high-end PvPers would ever prestige, because those abilities were essential to remain competitive. It was still a meaningless system that only rewarded vanity items that literally do nothing for the time invested. People argue that the vanilla system was worse, but I truly beg to differ, as best in slot was best in slot. Enchants, trinkets, odd items like low-level greens and crest rewards, and even professions push you to become more knowledgeable and excel in every aspect of the game to truly be better than another player. It's true that the gear disparity was huge, and somebody in greens had no chance of killing any class decorated in epics, but that's the point of an MMORPG. The person in greens that got completely owned in a PvP fight should have felt the need to get better gear, and and then step back up to the plate and go toe-to-toe with that player that owned them. The player will also have the same feeling of owning somebody that was decked out in greens like they used to be. Everybody has the potential to get good gear eventually. Time invested was rewarded eventually. There was light at the end of the tunnel. When you compared this with retail, everyone is the same. There is no drive to get better gear. There is no drive to farm gold to enhance your gear. There is no drive to do anything than push rating, which means nothing other than cosmetic enhancements for the top 0.5% of players. It goes against everything an MMO should be, and it is sad. Next, we have this one from Countdown to Classic Discord member Kaliva, who says this: "What triggers me most about the whole Classic versus Legion argument is that when people claim Legion is way too easy. While I do agree that everyone can get full epic gear without any effort, I bet my left nut most people who criticize Legion have never got to Mythic raiding, where the actual challenge lies. I'm totally biased because I never raided in vanilla, but still though." And we have this one from listener Brendan, who says this: "Growing up early teens playing WoW, I could only play every second weekend. When I visited my old man, my dad had a pretty decent computer which I would run to jump into Azeroth. He also bought a PS3 back then for my brother to play all his sports games. Every now and then my brother would want to come play The Sims, which I fucking hated. I was in Ubers grinding away for hours with mates, and at last we'd made it to the last boss, General Dracasath, when my older brother came in and kicked me off so that he could play his silly game, The Sims. I fought to stay on, but being the older brother, he got his way, which resulted in me angrily leaving the computer and smashing his PS3 and controllers and making a mess, which resulted in me being banned from the computer for the upcoming weeks and being grounded." And I say thank you so much to everyone for those anger management submissions. They were very angry this week. I love it. But now we'll move on to this week's winners and losers.
It wasn't going to be easy, but they've won it.
For winners and losers, Countdown to Classic brings you some of the best, most insightful posts of the week that I found in my travels through the forums or through the Discord in relation to what we've talked about. And I'll begin with this one from previous Countdown to Classic interviewee Taladrill, who says this on the PvP versus PvE authenticity argument. "Yeah, the general consensus, at least back then, was that PvE was far more popular with North American populations and PvP was hugely popular with Euro populations. When the game released in Europe, they weren't expecting the level of PvP interest that it got, and it overwhelmed the servers that were there. Also, this is probably why PvP servers for private scenes is a de facto requirement. Most of the population of WoW private servers is from Europeans. When Classic comes out, the massive increase in North American populations will be one of the biggest differences we'll see compared to what we're used to on private servers." Next we have this one from user Kippo1 over at Reddit, who says the following about the Living World argument. "The thing about this whole argument is that vanilla World of Warcraft isn't defined by your personal experience. There are tons of people out there who have never played vanilla World of Warcraft and are excited to do so when Classic comes out. And for those people, the experience will be completely new, even though it's an old game. Now, if you go about making custom changes just so the game feels fresh to old timers, then the people who have never played vanilla World of Warcraft will get a false representation of the game, because that's not how vanilla was back in the day, and so it's not the same game. Personally, I think that Blizzard wants Classic to be the static representation of vanilla World of Warcraft because, as they said, it's a game that has been embedded in the history of MMORPGs and has had a very significant impact on the development of the genre, and it's a shame that no one can officially access it any longer to see where it all started and what the game was that really blew up the whole genre. So because of that, I believe that they just want it to be a novelty product that people can visit to get a slice of MMORPG history. And for that to stay authentic, the game has to be exactly how it was back then. It's like when you visit World War II museums and see those really cool looking airplanes. You're not there to see some modernized version of a Spitfire. You're there to get a slice of that history and admire the vehicles how they were back then. I think that's the same for classic World of Warcraft. It's just a slice of history that is being made accessible because of the impact it has had in the industry, and making custom changes to the game would tarnish that and make for a fake representation of the game for those who never played it. And of course, where there's winners, there's gotta be a loser, and I keep the names out to protect the innocent, but we got this one this week when over at Reddit someone said this. I hope they add Blood Elves and Draenei, but keep the 60 cap. I actually liked playing as a Blood Elf. And to that post, I would say, but where would they start? If we've got Blood Elves and Draenei in World of Warcraft Classic, which I know many of you are freaking out about as I say that, what zone would we put them in to start at? Surely you're not also suggesting we put their starting zones in Classic. You're killing me. I do not support that change in any way, shape or form, and I'm sure many of you probably feel the same way. But anyway, with that bit of fun, now it's time for Memory Lane. Each week, Countdown to Classic brings you some listeners' fondest memories or funniest memories from back in the vanilla days. And this week, we'll kick off with Countdown to Classic Discord member Boom Kingley, who says the following. Regarding twinking, my two best friends and I did some level 29 twinking for a while. One played a rogue and we worked very hard to get him the absolute best in slot gear for that level. We did a lot of research for that. He could frequently one-shot people with backstab/ambush. I played a priest and a mage, and my other friend a shaman. We worked together to support our rogue. In the first story, we were running from blacksmith to stables in Arathi Basin, and a night elf priest was running up from the gold mine to the stables. She must not have been paying attention because she ran right out in front of our unstealth rogue friend, who over ventrilo said, "Oh really? Okay," and very calmly, quietly and gently reached out in front of him with a single dagger and poked her in the back for her entire health. We all bursted out laughing. In the second story, with the same group of friends, we were doing a Warsong Gulch that had a group that included 5 mages. They quickly realised how twinked my friend was and made a point of frost novaing him any time that they could. He quickly got frustrated and over the same ventrilo he said, "Alright, bitches," and he proceeded to stand still, pull out his bow, and still hit people for like a third or a half of their health. We jokingly said in chat that he multi-classed into Hunter out of frustration. That same rogue friend required financial support from our mains for how much vanishing powder and poison mats he would go through on a daily basis. It was amazing how much of that stuff we still had to ferry him any time we went to a major city. We queued from the Arathi Basin portal mostly. Anyway, shout out to Aranithia, Black End Fang, Tebeb, and Ventrilo. Maybe we should bring back Ventrilo for Classic for authenticity, huh? Next we have this one from listener Justin, who says the following. In spring of 2008, I played through the Warcraft RTS games, picking them up mostly out of curiosity. I remembered a childhood friend having a demo of Warcraft, Orcs and Humans on his family computer. I devoured them, playing all 3 plus the expansions in a couple of months, and then replaying them over and over. Before Warcraft, I'd only ever played console games, and they were all from Japan, like Nintendo and Sega. The Warcraft RTSs were both the first PC games and the first Western-made games that I'd really been able to get into. My brother had been playing World of Warcraft since vanilla and started trying to get me to play with him. I was skeptical. I thought the Warcraft RTS games were an anomaly for me and that I was a console gamer and would go back to stuff like Final Fantasy after I got bored with them. Looking back, I now realize they were actually the beginning of me becoming a PC gamer, and I barely touched a console since. But World of Warcraft was huge in 2008, and finally he said, "You can't go around calling yourself a gamer and just ignore the biggest video game on the scene right now." I conceded defeat and bought World of Warcraft plus the Burning Crusade and agreed to start playing with him. I made a troll shaman and my brother made an undead rogue that he trotted over to Durotar to start leveling with me. Even after a few hours in the game, I was still skeptical. The quest seemed a little incoherent and the core gameplay, tab targeting and hotkeys, felt underdeveloped. Less visceral than an action-based game like Legend of Zelda, and less understandable than a menu-based game like Final Fantasy. It just wasn't adding up for me. We continued playing our way up Durotar, moving through the canyon that's north of Razor Hill. When we came out the other side of the canyon, I could see the gates of Orgrimmar far in the distance. Over the next 10 minutes, everything changed. When we reached the city, it was bustling with players and NPCs. People were dueling in front of the gates and conversations were happening in the city trade chat. The design, architecture and overall vibe of Orgrimmar suddenly immersed me. I felt like I was in the game. Like Warcraft 3 had come to life and I'd been dropped in the middle of it all. Most of all though, I remember realizing just how truly massive this game was, and the games I'd previously thought were big were going to pale in comparison to this one. I'd gone from a skeptic to a true believer. I'll never forget that feeling of seeing the gates of Orgrimmar in the distance for the first time. The world of Azeroth suddenly seemed so huge. I've been playing ever since, and I enjoy it just as much as I did 10 years ago. I'm stoked about BFA, and I'm stoked about Classic. Keep up the good work, man. I hope I'll be listening to your podcast during my entire ride on the hype train. And next we hear again from Countdown to Classic Discord member Kaliva, who says this. I don't remember much from the vanilla days, but here's something I remember clearly. My first contact with WoW is when I stayed at a host family during a language course in the UK, which lasted for a week or so. When I came back home, I begged Mum to let me buy this super cool game, which I would totally play in moderation. Anyhow, I didn't know how the game worked at all, so when I hit something like level 15 on my Forsaken Warrior, I decided that I wanted to go meet the boy from the host family who introduced me to the game. I'd at least made sure to make my character on the same server, but I didn't think that the two factions couldn't communicate with each other. I knew that when I saw my friend playing, he was in this zone called Westfall. Not a big deal, it's on the same continent, I thought. So I started my journey through the Eastern Kingdoms. And there I went. I ran like Forrest Gump. I must have died tens of times on the way. It was a pretty dead server, so sadly I didn't meet too many people along the way who could have told me that I'm way too low leveled to run through burning steps. When I finally got to Westfall, after travelling for ages, I obviously couldn't find my friend anywhere, as we never arranged a meeting in the first place. I ended up exploring the Alliance territory for a bit before accepting that the trip was in vain and I hearthed back home. Next we have this one from listener Tybalt, who says the following. Weird antics can happen when you mess with people's heads. I loved my gnomish mind control cap and used it at every opportunity I could, especially in battlegrounds. It would often backfire, causing my target to mind control me instead, but that just adds to the charm. If you were outnumbered, it could turn a bad situation into a good one, and if it backfired, well, you were screwed to begin with anyway. I was a Horde rogue finishing up a Warsong Gulch battle with my mind control cap on, looking to secure the win. In the final battle to decide the match, I mind controlled what looked to be the best geared Alliance player on the enemy team and went to town. It just so happened to be a paladin. In the chaos of the fight, we killed the enemy flag carrier, returned the flag, and won. As we zoned back to the Undercity, my guildmate asked me what that strange icon was under my health bar. I looked over at my buffs and saw an icon I hadn't seen before. I put my mouse over it and laughed. My mind-controlled paladin had buffed me with Blessing of Kings. I gloated at the thought of being one of the first Horde to ever receive such a thing. The duration was short enough that I couldn't do anything with it, but I liked the idea anyway. It's not like we had any idea Horde paladins were coming a year later in the first expansion. Thank you, Susanna of Alexstrasza, US, for being my unwilling buff minion that day. It was unfortunate that you were still mind-controlled even after the battleground finished. You didn't teleport with me to Undercity, so you might have been killed by the Alliance Battlemasters when you returned home. I guess I'll never know. And finally we have this submission from listener Melderon, who tells us this. When WoW finally launched in 2004 or 2005 in Europe, I'm Swedish, I couldn't be more happy. But there was one freaking huge problem. I was 14 at the time and lived in the countryside in Sweden. There was no broadband where I lived, and at the time of release, I didn't know when we would get it. Regardless, I bought the game right away and just hoped for news of broadband reaching out to where I lived. Not too long after, there was some good news. Broadband would arrive, but it wasn't decided exactly when. Months went by without me being able to play because of poor internet speeds. During that time, I watched all the videos I could find. I read forums and planned on what I wanted to do in the game. I was dead set on being a paladin, my favorite hero unit in Warcraft 3. In June 2005, I finally got the news that the work on the mast, which would be used to deliver broadband/ADSL, was being worked on and that it would be finished in August. That felt so good. Finally, I'd be able to start playing soon, just 2 months left, but I could not wait those 2 months. School was over and the summer break had started. I had some friends playing World of Warcraft that lived in a small community about 40 minutes away from where I lived. They did have broadband. I jumped at the chance to go stay with one of those friends for 3 days and bring my computer with me. You remember that you got your first 30 days for free when you started a subscription? Well, I spent those 30 days for free on 3 days because I couldn't wait. And fuck me, was it worth it. When I logged on for the first time as a troll rogue, I was out of breath of excitement. The world was so huge. There were other players there, and it was beautiful. During those 3 days, I got to experience Durotar, Orgrimmar, and the beauty of the Barrens. My friend and I also got boosted by his older cousin, who was playing a level 60 enhancement shaman. When that guy came to our aid for Wailing Caverns, I dropped my jaw. It was the coolest character I had ever seen. He wore the PvP rank 9 and 10 set together with the epic mace Unstoppable Force from Alterac Valley Exalted Rep. Fuck me, that was cool. I count those 3 days among the best days of my life. The days that I fell in love with World of Warcraft. P.S. Some of you might wonder why I started a troll rogue instead of a paladin when I'd rambled on about how I loved paladins from Warcraft 3. Well, the answer is simple. I found videos of rogues two-shotting clothies with big crits in PvP and winning duels easily, also with big crits. That sealed the deal for me in a heartbeat. I was going to play a rogue. And that's been Memory Lane for the week. And now I just want to do a quick bit of cleanup from a previous episode. I got the following email from listener Balv, who said this. I'm sure you've caught up now as I'm watching old videos from episode 1 through the current episode, but in episode 16, someone talked about dodge healing, which I imagine they meant cancel healing, where they cast a, say, holy light, then move or jump to cancel if the target is healed before it would land to save the mana. Rinse and repeat, let it go if it would be useful, cancel if someone else beats them to it. Cheers, Balv. And I say thank you so much for clearing that up for me, Balv. That does make a little bit of sense. I very clearly remember saying, what the fuck is dodge healing? And that very well might be a valid explanation. So thank you for clearing that one up for me. Anyway, with that done, now it's shout out time. And huge shout out to last week's guest of the show, Kef Tank, who shouted out Countdown to Classic to former vanilla developer Mark Kern, who many of you know of. And Mark Kern was then kind enough to throw the show a follow and a retweet, which helped out a lot on the Twitter side of things. So thanks so much to those two. I messaged Mark after that and would love to get him on the show, so we shall see if anything eventuates later down the track. If you want to hear him on Countdown to Classic, then hey, why don't you tag us in a friendly tweet and let Mark know that not only does Countdown have an army of listeners, but that they'd love to hear him in an interview on the show. I know I would. And also, shout out to the anonymous $30 tip I got last week over at Ko-Fi. Thank you so much for that. If you let me know your name, then I'd be happy to shout it out here on the show, but I completely appreciate if you also want to remain anonymous. Now, time for some shout outs around the world to Brazil, Poland, and Serbia. Hvala što ste slušali. I pray that makes some sense in Serbian. And I dare say that's the first and likely last time in my life a Serbian word would come out of my mouth. Hopefully that means thank you for listening. Please tell me if I got that wrong. But thank you to those countries where I see many downloads of Countdown to Classic rolling in. Stateside, hello to Minneapolis, Las Vegas, and Lafayette. Louisiana in the house. I love it. I've never been. I'm dying to go. I got invited to Mardi Gras about 5 months before Katrina hit and somewhat always regretted not going. The reason I didn't go is when I asked my friend who invited me where he was staying, he told me that he'd be sleeping soundly in the gutter. So I politely declined the invitation to Mardi Gras that year. Anyway, that's the show, everyone. But just before you go, I just want to shout out to the members of the Countdown Council, whom I call every week for input on where the show should head in the week to come. So shout out to Borzen, Raidmar, Camps Allen, Palfurus, Permadrunk, Rarebit, Seven Winters, Tsunami, The Anton, Wilson Ma, and Velarco. Thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support. Also, a big thank you to supporters Hurlbert, Good Kisser, Myrtlebanks, and Purgatos81 as always. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. I shall see you again on Monday when we kick off another interview week over at Countdown to Classic. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you're going to get 3 interviews. I'm pushing them out just so I can catch up a little bit as I'm sitting on a fair few, and I need to pump them out so I can catch up and not have potential interviewees on the show waiting 6 weeks to be interviewed, because right now I'm booked out with interviews up until August 24th. That's how busy I'm getting with people wanting to come on the show and tell all of you about their expertise about vanilla World of Warcraft, which is a phenomenal thing. But in order to have more and more people coming on the show, I would prefer to have like a 2 to 3 week turnaround time when I can say, hey, come on the show, I'd love to have you. Are you available in 2 weeks? Rather than, hey, what are you doing in April of 2023? So I hope you understand that there'll be no forums or lore episode next week, but there will be a lore episode the week after that, and it's looking like the lore episode is going to be about Duskwood. So that should be a fun one, I am sure. Look forward to those 3 interviews. You're getting one all about everything and anything majors in general, which is fantastic, from Hardcore Raider North. Then we're going to hear all about Twinking at 19 with Countdown to Classic Discord member and previous interviewee of the show, Funk Nasty. And then we're going to round it all out with an interview about Holy Priests with Countdown to Classic Discord member Borodin. So I can't wait to bring you all of those. It's going to be a great week. I really look forward to it. And have a great weekend. And I'll see you next week, everyone.